What do you mean what do you mean it's a myth? You can be an indie game developer if you want to just make games. If you want to be an indie game developer and earn a living from it, that's a different matter. So what do you mean it's a myth indies get paid up front? I don't understand, XP. AXP, I don't know what you're thinking here, but the only reason why I could get an advance, which is what you're talking about, get paid up front, is because I had something to sell, which was, my reputation for making football games. But you've got to say, it's like, if you don't get paid up front, how the hell can anybody make a game? I mean, a small tiny game, yes, but this game that I've been doing is probably in total by now 2 years of my life, full time at least. What was I supposed to do? And I say full time, if I'm working 90 hours a week, it's like there's no time for anything else, so I'm actually working more than that. What am I supposed to live on? What am I supposed to do? So for a very long period of time, indie was in effect dead, because the only way you could make independent games was in your spare time, i.e. a hobby, not actually doing it professionally. The only way you can develop a video game professionally is if you get an advance, and you don't stop being an indie game developer just because you earn a living. I think that's not the right way of looking at it at all. The indie and indie game development means that you have creative control. That's my definition. If a developer has the creative say in the game, they're independent. The moment they lose the creative say of what's in the game, they're no longer independent. So that means that you could have an independent game developer that is people employed by a company. It's down to the philosophy. It's the philosophy of the game. It's not to do with money. I mean, basically, everybody deserves to be paid for their work, and you can't expect people to, go begging in the street while they are developing video games. So it's like, there has to be a way. That's why you get the Kickstarters are popular. Why do people want to raise money? It's because they want to be able to work on the game. So, and the whole thing about advances is the way the industry has always been, really, until the alternative of crowdfunding came along. Games and even crowdfunding is the same model. You're paid in advance for developing the game. It's just the reality. I don't think it makes it a myth in the slightest. Although there are some people out there who, try to make a meal of the principle, and sort of suggesting that somehow, it's not indie game development if the developer is not sort of brought to their knees and starving and struggling to keep a roof over their head and working in a job, at the same time, doing something. Like, I work in a bar, but in my spare time I'm developing a video game. Hey, cred, it's just... it's like... That's probably where we're going to go in the end, because that's what's happened with music. There are very few really professional musicians. Yeah, and Raduga, that's correct. I may have got a budget for developing the game, but that doesn't mean a thing. The fact that there are games out there that are made from people working in their spare time, it's, doesn't mean that if you get an advance, it's not indie game development. I'm not ready to accept that as being the distinguishing, feature. I could, over all these years, I could have worked on games in my spare time, but I didn't. Well, I did actually in the last few years. I did up until about 5 or 6 years ago. I really didn't. Why? Because I had to earn a living, and I'd come home and I'd be tired. Or I was working at companies where, they didn't want you to work on things in your own time. There's some when I was working in America, that was always a potential issue. Or, I tried to work on games in my spare time. I tried to do this thing called the Kickoff. It was actually, I gave up on it. I gave up for personal reasons. I gave up on it because of I didn't feel I was getting the support I needed within my personal life on that one. That's the reason why that one stopped. But then there was also the other problem, which is like, is it going to... I could do a whole bunch of work and it come to nothing. I made an entire game, networked off-road combat vehicle game called Buggy Wars. But then I'm there and it's like, I think the most people I had playing that online game was about 6 at one time. That was it. And I stopped it because there was just not enough interest. I couldn't put my effort and work into that while at the same time having a job. And now I get paid the money, advances. Then there are royalties from what we sell. I can tell you the probability is it's going to take a long time before I see any royalties. Because you have to pay it all back. Which kind of sucks. It's like, because the problem there is that you're stuck. It's like, well, you finish the game. If your game is going to have a tail, and I tell you that Kickoff Revival needs to rely on a tail, because of the wonderful hatchet job that was done. So, the point is that tail, you have to earn a living while you're waiting to get any money from the royalties, which has to first pay off your development. So from the business side of it, if you don't have the right kind of people supporting you, it's impossible. It could be that next year I'm having to find a job and I can't continue doing this to sustain myself. If that's the case, then it would be pretty depressing for me, because I would be needing to do some other work that would be tiring me out, and I wouldn't be able to. I would come home and I've got to find the energy. If there's an audience, that's different, right? If there's an audience, that can sustain me. But when you're making a game and you don't have the audience here, it's a chicken and egg. You need to have the audience, but you can't have the audience until you have the game. And the motivator for making a game is the audience. At least that's the way I look at it. So it wasn't until I had partners I could work with that I could trust, that trusted me, and so mutual trust, and they're able to sort of put literally their money where their mouth is. Until that came about, I couldn't see myself to doing it. We'll see. It's not a meaningless buzzword. Oh, come on, XP. It's not meaningless any more than it is to say, people be a humanitarian. What does humanitarian mean? I'm a game developer. I'm an independent game developer because I make the games I want to make. Simple as that. No problem. Do you make the games you want to make? If you make the games you want to make, you can call yourself an independent game developer. If you work in a big developer or a publisher and they tell you which games to make, or the marketing department interferes with the vision of the game, that doesn't sound like independent game development. If you're brought on to port a game from one platform to another, a game that's already been made, and you're paid to do that, which is what happens, because nobody's going to convert that for you, you know, on the basis of you don't get any money while you're working in a bar. That's just not going to work. So if you want to get the thing converted, you want to find, this is work for hire. Now, work for hire goes on a lot in the industry. If you do work for hire, that's not independent game development. It's because you're told what to do. Right, here's the game, we need to port it to the Xbox. Can you do it? Yes. Okay, do it. Not independent game development. So it's that simple as that. It's the creative control. You can't say it doesn't exist, because as soon as you do that, then you have nothing to describe something that actually does exist. Just because there isn't a clean line that defines black and white doesn't mean that it's useless to have those two sides named. So there is a grey area, definitely. But I'm definitely an independent game developer. And somebody working at Rockstar on the next incarnation of Grand Theft Auto probably isn't an independent game developer. But of course, it's still, because you have a publisher doesn't mean you're not independent. You know, it's like independent film doesn't sort of not have anyone to help. Even if I was published directly by Sony, it would still be independent game development. No Man's Sky is independent game development. They're an indie game developer. It doesn't matter on the size. It matters on creative independence, which, given the fact of the reaction that their game got, and a lot of it was to do with the nature of the game. And this is why they take that flack. If the game had been put out by, if the game had just been put out directly from Sony as a Sony product without the game developer themselves being visible, it's not a Sony game. It's a Hello Games game. And they stand by their game. Conceived and developed independently of, the publisher. The publisher has their input, but they make the calls. It's very much like that. It doesn't really matter how many game developers. It really doesn't. You can have an independent game developer with 1,000 people. You could actually argue that is Bethesda an independent game developer? Yeah, I could argue yes. Because they make their own games, they publish their own games. So that's how I feel about it. No, it's the funding. It's nothing to do. If you go with the idea that funding is dependent, you're only indie if you don't get funded by a publisher, then you can wipe out a whole bunch of games and say they're not indie anymore. I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think it's harder for there to be creative freedom when you have a publisher involved. Sure, it can be a challenge, but if you have a good relationship, the right kind of relationship, you can get the funding and still maintain your independence. Who owns the intellectual property is very key here. If you like, you can go down that legal way as to demark whether or not you're an independent game developer. Who owns the IP of KOR? I do. It's not owned by the publisher. It's not owned by Sony. I own it. It's me. It's mine. Let's take a look at Minecraft. Was Minecraft an independent game? Indie game? Yes, it was an indie game. Is it still an indie game? No. Why? Because the intellectual property has been bought by a company. This is another way of looking at it, which can be quite... There's pretty strong argument for saying that Minecraft was an indie game but isn't anymore. When Notch owned the IP of Minecraft, it was his game, independently owned. Then one day he sells it for $3 billion, and now Microsoft own it. Now it's owned by a company, not an individual. It's not perfect, because you can have partnerships between people, and so with partnerships what you do is that you technically have the IP owned by a company so that you can share the rights, and you can have that and still be an indie game. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but the spirit is quite clear. At a certain point, it's the game IP is bought by Microsoft. We can say that's pretty clear that it's no longer an indie game. Because you have to say, when you say indie or independent, you have to say independent from what? It's usually the problem, isn't it? When we use language, we say words and we don't know what they mean. We don't define what they mean. Independent from what? There's only one really good answer. Independent from outside creative control. And if you accept that, you know, I'm not saying that's the best way to answer the question, but I think it's good enough. Independent of outside creative control. Well, you know, I don't care what other people say indie is. I think I have a right to say what I think indie is, having been an indie game developer way before the term indie was invented. You know, you could say, oh, I've lost my status as an indie game developer because I am earning a living from what I do. That's the way you end up in the end. I operate as a company. Yes, I do. So that's why I said it's not a hard and fast rule. But answering the question, who has the creative control of the product? Who owns it? Or the company that holds the IP. In the end, it comes down to an individual. So that's what I think. What don't you agree with me on? You don't agree that independent game development is best defined by saying that the game is developed with independent creative control? Well, give me what your definition is. We'll try it out. I'm not saying it's the best. It's the best I can come up with. You can think of a better one, because I can think of a zillion definitions that would rule me out as an independent game developer, and I would have to reject any that did that, because I consider myself to be an independent game developer. So we'll see. No, XP, there isn't. There's so many different kinds of game developer, you know. So many different kinds of game development. I don't think it does it enough. Yeah, but Mac, if the wiki says that, I disagree vehemently with that definition, but it would not surprise me that something like Wikipedia would push it in that direction. The fact that my game had an advance to develop it does not mean that my game is not an indie game. And if anybody tries to take away my right to call myself an independent game developer because I've made games with an advance, or that I would not be an independent game developer if I got crowdfunding, I will vehemently argue against that view, because I consider that to be actually a bit insulting. Where would the place in the end be for that ground? What are we going to do? Not call it indie? What do we call it then? Because it's certainly not AAA. Now really, right now, we have AAA and we have indie in practice. You know, to say the idea there are people out there who want to try and remove that middle ground between, you know, the totally, oh, we do it for the love of it, we're not about actually selling anything or making a living, and if we happen to, that's great. If you want to be an indie game developer, you have to generate everything for yourself from your sales, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but if that is the one side, and then the other side there's AAA, there's the bit in the middle, which are people who effectively do the same thing as that version of indie, but have business partnerships to help them do it. And I am absolutely sure there are people out there who are trying their best to squeeze that middle bit out, to basically say your game is not independent game because you did it as a business. And if that's the way that goes, there's no place for that form of game development to be. And that if you look at what's actually going on, you will find that it's that form of game development that takes the most heat. The AAA on the one end and the, well, it's harmless on the other, but the middle bit where it's actually independent to the point where it's actually treating it primarily as a business, forming partnerships as needed and whatever, it feels like it's under attack. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but that's the way it feels. Hello, Wickerman.
Hello, Wickerman.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there is, you could say there's homebrew. Well, even that doesn't work. There's indie and there is not. That's, for me, is the way it works, because you could sit there arguing over this. The thought that the moment that somebody raises money to make a game with a Kickstarter, and where do you draw the line? You know, because the KOR was made with a budget. Yes, it was made with a budget and money, yeah, but in order to get the deal, I had to make a prototype. That prototype was not funded. Where does it go? Indie is installing Unity. Don't tell me that Indie is a myth, because you're saying that everything that I do and stand for in video games is a myth. I'm not going to be happy about that. Because, what do I call myself otherwise? Right. I can't call myself a AAA developer. I say I'm just a game developer. Well, that could mean anything. I could be doing work for hire and be a game developer. What do? I make my own games my way, and I figure out a way to get them to market. Independent game developer. Thank you. Well, the people who try to make indie something that depends on how the game is funded, as I say, I don't take that seriously, and I can't take Wikipedia seriously, because it's just as far as I'm concerned, Wikipedia is just a troll. There is a lot of activity on Wikipedia that you could say is a bit like trolls trying to find acceptability, trying to validate themselves. Let's put it that way. The other thing is that if you do it funding-wise like that, you have a problem, because when you've got your first successful game, let's say, and it brings in money that you can then invest in another game, does that game become not indie because the money was available before the game started? You see the problem. It's like, oh, we're an independent game developer because our game, we didn't, we're pure and all that, we didn't get any, no, we just did. And then it was a hit, and we had a lot of money, and we decided to make another game. So really, can you say they continue to be an independent game developer because the money came from themselves? The complication there is that probably by this time they're wanting to expand, and well, it was a hit, so the IP might actually need to be controlled in some kind of holding company thing or whatever. You could say, is it the company that funds then the game, the holders of the IP, if there's more than one? How does that work? Can you just say that the money, the funding for a game, because it came from a game that was indie? What about if the money came from a game that wasn't indie? Is there any material difference between the funding coming from a successful game? Let's say, I don't really see that it's meaningful. It's just like, oh. And one can say that crowdfunding is just a form of pre-sales. Advanced sales, but they're just selling the game before it's made. So that would mean that it's not indie anymore, because they sell in advance of release. If the publisher wouldn't fund the game, would it still exist? I would still have the prototype. Would I have continued working on the prototype? Quite possibly. Would it have been released on a console? No. Could I afford to have developed for a release on a console first? Probably not. I don't think that's the right way to look at it either. That if the game wouldn't have been made if it wasn't funded, I don't see that that's relevant. Come on, the only thing I can see that makes sense is that the reason why the award groups don't give you an answer is because they don't know. Nobody. It's one of those things you can't define. Like, rigidly. You could, for award purposes, make up some arbitrary definition of what qualifies for your award, but that would not be necessarily the same thing as saying it's indie. They're just saying something that you know, you and Brad would fund it. Well, if you've got some money to invest, and we should have a chat about it, because I'm quite sure there's some great stuff that we could do together. I'll even call myself not an indie game developer, if that helps. Anyway, I've got to get on. Let's have a look at Peru. Have a name check. Galizi Rodriguez Corzo. Yeah, Mac. Seriously.
Good night, Mac Cod.
If Battlefield was developed with the creative control of the publisher, of the developer, you can argue it was indie, but then it sounds a bit ridiculous. So maybe you need to look at it in terms of who has the creative control of the IP, who owns the IP. I think it's kind of connected. You know, who owns the IP? But seriously, DICE, if DICE are a developer independent of a publisher, even if funded by the publisher, they are an independent developer. Technically, that is the case. If the moment they're bought by a publisher, you can say they're not independent anymore, and that is often the case. You know, so often developers get bought by publishers. They can say then they're definitely not independent. So you've got an argument to say that Battlefield could be an indie game, but of course that does sound a little bit silly. You could put a word in there, independently funded. That doesn't work, because suddenly you say, well, it doesn't count if it's funded by, you know, founded by crowdfunding. I would say that's independently funded, but you say, no, it isn't. Okay, what does it mean, independently funded? Are the people who make Rocket League, are they an indie game developer? Yeah. When did ID cease to be an independent game developer? I don't know if they've ever been bought out. Hey, Tehu. XP. An indie is anyone that's seen Unity. Yes, it's ever passed across their consciousness. Even seen a Unity game. If you see a Unity game, you're indie. That's it. I think it's better. I think it's better, Tehu, if what we do is, yes, exactly what Matt Codd said. It's best if each developer characterises himself whichever way, or herself whichever way they want. Perfect. And people either believe you or they don't. If DICE want to call themselves an independent game developer, They can explain why. They could say, because we develop our content independent of the creative control of a publisher or any company external to us. Therefore, we are an independent game developer. And I'll say, good on you. I understand that. You're right. Doesn't matter how big you are. Doesn't matter, how your game is funded. Great. You get paid. You keep the IP. I need to check though. You own the IP? Yes, we own the IP. Okay, you presumably get royalties or payments from it? Yes, we do. It sounds like a good old version of the industry I remember well. You're an independent game developer. Congratulations. Carry on. So in other words, what you have to do is ask the developer why they consider themselves to be indie and let them call themselves indie. And that's it. So, on that basis, why am I an independent game developer? Because I came up with the idea for the game myself. The original idea 25 years ago. I've designed the game myself. I developed the prototype myself. I developed the prototype without any funding. I found a publisher. They helped me get the deal with Sony that enabled me to actually make the game. But I have complete control over the game. The game content, which is true. The game content up to me. I say what we'd like to put in, the suggestions are made, so on, but in the end I make the call of what makes the cut, what doesn't make the cut, and how to deal with the situation where we find our backs up against the wall. I make those calls. And the IP is mine. And so therefore I declare myself to be an independent game developer for those reasons. So, you know why I consider myself to be one. And that has to be the whole conversation. And so, Mac, your idea is perfect. Definition is an independent game developer is someone who calls themselves an independent game developer with a straight face. XP, stop it. Because I've just lived through 20 years where independent game development was dead. So please, just stop it. I don't want you killing independent game development again. We just got it back. Activision, when they started off, I don't know. They're not an independent game developer, they're a publisher. So what did I call myself? A game developer. And I may have even used the word independent. It means not depending on any one company. That's another definition that you can have. What is an independent game developer? It's a game developer that doesn't depend entirely on their income from their business from one source. I could make a game tomorrow and find another publisher. If things work out well, we'll be branching out into making more games that will go somewhere else. You see the point? In the 70s garage with a bedroom coder. Yeah. You know, there was someone I don't know. I won't go there. All right. Anyway, so let's see. Peru was done. So let's try. We have to do Paraguay now. I suppose the thing that really annoys me is people who don't know so much about video game development out there, the audience, members of the audience and so on, who want to try and weigh in on this subject. People who don't really know. But they have very strong opinions. And they're the ones who sometimes get back to me and say things like, "You're not an indie." And they try to explain to me why I'm not an indie. And you can tell that its purpose of what they're doing is not the question of how we define what indie is. It has to do with trying to invalidate certain realities that I talk about. Small budget, working as you see me work here, which is certainly not the kind of the stereotype that you get from like a big game development, and that's, I find, upsetting, because it's like I'm saying, look, you must understand when I'm making this game that you can't compare it to a AAA title like FIFA, Pro Evolution Soccer and so on. And they come back to me and say, but you're not really indie. Well, Mac, let's just use what I think we've kind of evolved here as a process for deciding whether you need to go to EA if you want to understand whether or not FIFA is indie, or rather the FIFA games are indie games or not, is that you need to go to the publisher and ask them, "Hello EA, do you consider FIFA to be an indie game?" And they will say no, and we're done. I've got a point. So, but they won't. XP, they won't say it's indie. But let's just say hypothetically, for some weird reason they did say, then it's meaningless unless they can justify it. Our game is indie because we are EA and we are independent of anyone else. And so, okay, on that basis, we know what they're independent of. They're independent of outside influences on what they can do. Okay. So they call themselves indie now, and that's why. And we don't have to agree. You see, they could call themselves indie, but we could choose what to call them. And I can think of a few appropriate phrases that would fit in there perfectly well. Okay, so I've sorted this out. Let's check this out. Villa Patino Gomez. Oh, frack. Paraguay is wrong already with the first one. Okay, Fernandez.